Lowy, for instance, who introduced me to Rotzel.
Mm-hmm.
Lowy thought Rotzel was a great mind, and I had only known Rotzel of the very limited perspective that we had through Miss Semple, and it was this Lowy Rotzel introduction that gave me a new opening, an opening of the geography of the life of primitive peoples that I might never have gotten into if it hadn't been for this originally quite accidental connection. And so I became an Indian geographer without having intended to do anything of that sort. And this, of course, took me back in culture and in time. And when they asked me to give the Bowman lectures at New York, I thought, well, you might as well express what you think and hope about agricultural origins and dispersals. So it's not a planned course. It's if anything the fortunate chance to see openings and get into them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But now, a little while ago, you wrote a paper, which is a very interesting one. It said, what happened to physical geography? Do you think anybody has ever answered that paper?
Well, I've had requests for reprints from it and comments on it, and the only comment that I know of that referred to it was one that Wilma Fairchild made in reviewing her first few years as editor of Geographical Review, and she said that what was it? That whether because of Lely's sternly pointing finger or for other things, that there was a revival of interest in physical geography. And of course, whatever may be the cause, there is that revival, undoubtedly. And there's a great deal of work being done now that was not being done 20 years ago. I won't take any credit for it.
Well, I think you deserve some credit for it, because you certainly pointed the finger at the need. And as you said, I think in some place, it probably is true that some of the tremendous success of the Davis system, in a sense, postponed work on physical geography.
I think so. I think that there are various ways in which it did that. One of them is, of course, that ideas later than Davis didn't get introduced into geography in this country, and yet there were many new ideas.
I had come from the Netherlands, and I had heard about the Santa Clara Valley, so I made my headquarters here in Berkeley, and then I made the study of the Santa Clara Valley in 1930.
And that was done under Sauer?
Not really directly. I must say I got good advice from him, but it was done actually for the University of Utrecht, where I got my degree then. Yes, but it was very much in the Sauer tradition.
And it was written in English?
Yes, kind of fractured English, but my wife fixed that up, and so it got published in English, indeed.
Well, it's a very famous paper. Even today, people are quoting.
I've developed a kind of a notion, for example, that one can describe many of the culture processes of the early human race as patterns of divergence. We started theoretically in a Garden of Eden, and man has spread out all over the world, and in working out the ecology of his living systems in different local areas, man has evolved a whole series of different culture patterns. And I incline, and Bill Thomas is a part of this, of course, to call this a pattern of divergence. And for man, I think this takes, out of 2 million years, if you accept that as the date for man, this takes about 1,999,500 years. It's been going on most of our human history. But since about the Columbian discoveries, we've been coming back together again. And we see it in the simple ways that Coca-Cola's all over the world, and chewing gum and lipstick and so on. But there's more than that behind it. And many of the culture processes are beginning to bring the world back together again. So this is a pattern of convergence. Now, I have applied this in a preliminary sense to a worldwide pattern. A pattern of divergence of cultures and then a pattern of convergence of cultures.
And between the anthropologists and Sauer, I decided that geology was not for me, and so by my senior year I'd made my mind up that I was going to give it up because of its disregard of man. One thing had happened when I was there, that Stephenson came and he built a snow house, and I've been an avid reader of his works, and so I decided I wanted to go north as well. And I recall that I wrote a letter to him and said, I want to go north. How can I do it? He said, well, if you want to go north, just pick up and go. And so I left home after I had graduated with $20 that my father gave me as I was boarding the streetcar.
I think Schaefer has had a remarkable impact on our field. Now, Schaefer had already died when I went to Iowa in 1958.
Well, you had some relationship to one of his...
Well, yes, very early. I never know whether I'm a culprit or not in this case, but if you recall, Henry Kendall was editor of the Annals during the mid-50s, and at that time the Annals had 3 readers, sort of editorial assistants, and we read the manuscripts that came in. And all 3 of us read this article, and although Henry knew that there was going to be some reverberations as a result of publishing it, all 3 of us felt that the profession should read what Schaefer had written. We didn't recognize the impact it was going to have at that time, I must say.
I realized this, it came up when, during the Second World War, I was in Washington, Jimmy was in Washington. We had many young men there working with us who had published quite a little, some of them, and certainly were doing research there, whether it was out in their name or not. And they felt that it was just too long before they were being recognized. And well, I agreed with them. We agreed with them. And we, in one case, there had formerly been an average of, what, 2, 3, or 4 new members a year.
Yeah.
We looked into this, had a special meeting of a dozen of members who were in Washington, and between us, we nominated 53, of whom 30-odd ones were taken in. In other words, 10 times the previous annual average, I suppose, of new members. But that, they should have been, many of them, taken in earlier.
And of course, 4 new members a year wouldn't take care of the deaths that were taking place and the resignations. Oh, actually, the membership was declining for many years.
Well, without question, the 1940s were a turbulent period. We had a lot of geographers coming together in Washington, and we had, as a result, the formation of what was, after a period of several months, evolution out of the young geographers through Geographical Research Associates into the American Society for Professional Geographers. This was a very painful period, a 5-year period, pain, soul-searching, but would you like to talk about this period that was brought to a very successful conclusion with the amalgamation in 1948?
I'd like to say one thing before we get to that, and that has to do with, I would like to explain to anybody that's interested, my own role as secretary back in 1936, 37. I was secretary, I think, from 36 to 41. And the secretary in those days was the fellow who really organized programs, ran meetings, carried out the correspondence. He was the person who did all the work. And he was therefore responsible for organizing the programs and also for local arrangements. I mean, this is a big job to do. And he was therefore, had more power perhaps than anybody else. Certainly more than the president, who simply came on for 1 year, and all of he was supposed to carry out the suggestions of the secretary as to what he should do when he got to the meeting, and then he had to make a presidential address, which was the big thing for the president. Well, in 1936, at the Syracuse meeting was held in Syracuse, New York, at the university. That's before I was at Syracuse. But they had a meeting for members only that was up at the campus of the university. And downtown hotel where the meeting was held, there were all these non-members milling around and sort of miffed for not being allowed to go to the meeting up on the campus. And as secretary, I asked Ed Ackerman, who was not a member then, to organize a young geographers group and have a special roundtable discussion of something in the hotel. And this he did. And this was the origin of the Young Geographers Society, which became the ASPG.
I would like to review your role in the ASPG and the amalgamation with the Association of American Geographers. Can you begin with the informally organized Young Geographer Group, back in December of '36 at Syracuse?
That represented the beginning, but not that far back. The first I saw the Young Geographers was when George Dacey, who was my assistant and a very competent man in the War Department, we were both on Latin America, and he asked me one day if I'd go with him to a meeting in the Young Geographers. We were appalled when we found that the Young Geographers were being held back. That's what it was. And Shannon McCune was very close with, apparently his mentor at the time anyway, was George Cressy. And there was nothing wrong with George Cressy having said that to have the young men be patient, that someday they'll all be in the AAG, but it was very obvious that they couldn't be. AAG was taking in 15, 20 men a year. There weren't more than a couple of hundred even in time of war. And here were hundreds of geographers. We were analyzing, we were listing them. I was making a census of the geographers. I was helping pool recruit. And I was getting a mailing list a little later anyway, and I found out later that there were around 900 professional geographers. How could they possibly all get in the AAG? In other words, there was a desperate need for some organization, a service type of organization, for the many professional geographers there were.
I think Ralph Brown was unique in the sense of being a master teacher, and I think it was from that point of seeing a scholar operate with the full status and image of a scholar, at least to the students in that class, that leads you into a discipline if you are seeking to enter higher education, do this sort of work for the rest of your life. Brown was a very quiet man, a very gentle man. He smiled sort of teasingly at you at the end of classes, at the end of exams, at the end of conversations. But in between, he sort of gently poked you, pulled you, projected you along.
The non-material side is not well cultivated, partly because American culture is so hard to grasp in these terms. Dialect, language. In Morocco, it's so overwhelming. There are 40 dialects of Berber, and because they don't understand from one valley to another. Tremendous variations in religion, and the non-material culture is so subtle, so elusive, that literature hasn't developed very well.
Well, how would you reply to the charge that cultural geographers have been concerned primarily with the obscure and the insignificant? They go out to study the Berbers instead of studying American cities.
I wouldn't respond that way. It used to be a classic comment in anthropology textbooks to say, we go to primitive areas because they are simple, and we have to first develop our models in a simple context. This rationalization, although presented in prefaces to books, I don't think is the correct one. I think we go to these areas not because they're simple, but because they are so complex and rich. That you have this great variety of relic culture traits, of diversity, and that most cultural geographers have exactly the opposite view, say, of modern America, that we think it's homogenized and that it doesn't have the richness and diversity we can find in a country like Burma or Mexico.
I remember the first paper I ever gave was at the AAG meetings in East Lansing. That's maybe 1960 or 61. And there was exactly one session of physical geography, 4 or 5 papers, and 3 of us were graduate students. We fell all over each other.
The lack of of looking. I get really mad when somebody has a good seat in the aeroplane and the weather is fine and sits on the right side of the planes, on the Chinese place, and then he doesn't look down there at the American landscape, among other things. The student comes into my office and says he's had an interview with somebody. This happened just very few days ago, and cannot recall how the professor looked with whom she had an interview. Now, I find this disturbing. Students stand and I ask them, what do you see? First of all, they realize, I hope, that what they actually see is chaos, but now what do they observe? Is there anything that strikes their fancy or their interest? And it takes an awful long time until they are even willing to express themselves about something that they now have to see. They really want you to tell them, will you look at this? Will you look at that? I find that disturbing. And I have a hunch, I have no documentary proof. I have a hunch that a great deal of the ugliness about which we have lots of papers going on and discussions is partly due to the circumstance that people don't even see it.
You were sort of the shepherd of the amalgamation of the ASPG and the AAG. Didn't you assume the presidency at that point? Or?
Yes, but that's the point when I might have been called shepherd. I had nothing to do with the plans for the merging, joint organization, as it happens. I think Chauncey Harris did have quite a bit, and I've forgotten the others now. But for some reason or other, they thought, they knew it was going to be a problem to get the two groups merged happily together, and they thought that maybe I would be able to do that.
And you did?
I didn't know this. It occurs to me, I hadn't thought before, that may have been because in Washington, I did act somewhat that way. The geographers there were brought in to work on intelligence, geographic intelligence, with three different organizations. The Army, the Navy, and then this new upstart organization, Donovan's OSS.
Yeah.
See? And we shortly discovered, as one English person in the same position put it in London, he said he came there on the assumption that the enemy was across the channel. He said, now I've learned better. He's across the street. And actually we had the geographers in different groups fighting because the admiral up here and the general here and another general were fighting with each other for...
Things never changed in that respect, I'm afraid.
Right, I suppose.
Well, it was summertime and hot, and they stopped in Columbus, and Dick and his daughters stayed overnight with the Peaties, and let the kids get cleaned up and so on. And during their visit, Dick asked Petey, did he know anybody in geography who knew how to make maps? And Petey said, oh, sure, I do. He's been working for me. And Dick talked to me, but then about a month later, in October or thereabouts, I got a call from Washington. Would I come down and work with him in the budding geography division of the COI, which was the forerunner of the OSS.
This is prior to Pearl Harbor.
Oh, yes, this is prior to Pearl Harbor.
Had you met Hatchon before? Or
No.
First night in Ohio, is that right? First time you met him?
First time I'd ever met him, yeah. I had been in, I should say I'd had the nature of geography inflicted upon me.
So you were in awe of him, whatever the word was, huh?
No, I wasn't.
You wasn't?
It didn't awe me, no.
Okay.
But at any rate, I went to Washington, and there were three of us there to begin with in one office. Dick Hartshorn was the head man, Ed Ackerman, and me.
Well, your work in Ecuador had some rather, shall we say, practical application for the war effort. What did that involve?
That involved looking for quinine, or better yet, procuring quinine. The title given the individuals who were engaged in this activity was procurement specialist. But first we had to go out in the company of a botanist to be able to identify the quinine trees, the cinchona trees. And then after that was done, and there were some 25, 28 expeditions on both sides of the Andes, from the Paramo on down to about 5,500, 6,000 feet, within that range.
It's indigenous to that area, is it
This
not?
was indigenous to this area. In fact, early records indicated, I think I'm correct in this, that the bark was sent from Peru over to Europe because in Peru it was known to be curative for fever. And the name Cinchona simply was the name of a Spanish princess in Peru whose name was Countess de Cinchona. Had nothing to do with the bark per se. Actually, the bark was named, or was known by the name Uritusinga, which is the name of a mountain in southern Ecuador, by that, as I say, a mountain by that name. This was the original site.
When the war came along, Ed was first went to Washington as a consultant on commuting weekends, as he put it, and then he became the foreign map editor of the Army Map Service.
I, by the time World War II began, had at my fingertips a pretty good knowledge of the nature and coverage of all the countries in the world, particularly the countries which were involved in the earlier fighting. And the U.S. Army had never had a mapping library and production system to approach such a problem. And so I came down, my first experience really in organization. We had a tremendous organizational task in front of us. The organization had 59 people, and we grew to 6,000 in the 4 years. We needed people who knew how to make maps. We needed map materials. We used to comb the libraries and the professors of the countries for materials. Looking back on it, there were 2 or 3 heavily projects that took a lot of time in an editorial sense. These were working with non-alphabets in non-Roman languages. We had to develop a force of about 120 Japanese, around 200 Chinese to transliterate and transcribe names from these foreign languages.
Well, we were self-contained as a unit of art, and when we landed overseas, we had our own vehicles and so forth, and we had our own drivers and so on. And our task was to unravel the German mapping organization. And we spent 13 months on that. I did probably 13,000 miles in a Jeep in Germany, and following right along behind various units as they went across and captured any German prisoners. We'd sit up all night long interviewing them, trying to find where their mapping depots were to send back copies of their maps, trying to find where their mapping offices were, how they were making maps. In fact, one thing we were chasing down were the great big aerial stereoplanographs. And we'd had only one stereoplanograph in the United States at that time, back in 1932, when they used the stereoplanograph to make the 1-foot contour map for Boulder Dam. And Birdseye, who was head of the Geological Survey in the country, wanted to keep that planograph, but they couldn't get enough money, so it was shipped back to Germany. And meanwhile, the Germans continued to produce these things, and these planographs wanted, when we got into Jena with that team, I found where all those 54 planographs that had been manufactured were. And there were about 17 of them in the German army, and we went chasing those from one end of Germany to the other.
At the same time, I do feel that there is this vague center of interest of geographers are concerned with the nature of places, and space, of course, and that's what ties us together, this broad, diverse confederation of people. But we have our tentacles out in many, many directions, and that's the way it should be. And if I've seen one tendency in the 40-odd years that I've been associated with geography, it is that we've become more Catholic, more ecumenical in our activities, that we belong to more associations, we publish in more different journals, we reach across these fences into other departments, other disciplines.
Do you recall that in 1971 you described geography as the last refuge of Renaissance man?
Yeah, I recall that, and perhaps it was the only clever thing I said in that interview, and I still believe it.
You still believe it?
Yeah, that's one reason I like being a geographer. It's the only discipline I know where you can study almost anything and get away with it.
Interesting. When I went as a student to Chicago, the department was organized on the basis of specialties and areas. And I remember hearing the department members talk about the appointment of a new member of the faculty. And they'd taken a matrix and they figured out that they needed somebody that could teach about Australasia and the polar regions and who could also do historical geography. And having worked out that cell as being the missing set of cells, they said there was only one person who could fill it, and that was Griffith Taylor from Australia. So he was brought to the university. That's the way the department thought of its duties. It had to cover each region of the world, and it had to cover each specialty. By the 50s, although Bob Platt had been very influential in functional approach to regional problems, the department no longer felt it had to cover every region of the world. Nor did it feel it had a large obligation to provide instruction in regional geography as such. It was moving in the other direction. And the new appointments we made, such as Barry and Meixel, were appointments of people that had specialties, that they were of a more systematic sort. And we were in effect demonstrating the kind of trend that Ed Ackerman had been talking about, the shift from regional to systematic organization.
I said, I'd like to have a co-author, and they said, that's all right if you're responsible. And then Ed Ullman and I got together, and Ed had a theoretical mind. He said, why don't we just do a theoretical paper? So we sat down, did one on the theory of the general distribution of urban settlements and the theory of the pattern within a city. And it was a simple typology, but that paper's been reproduced more times by far than anything else I've done. I guess maybe 50 times.
Did you say that you and Ed did that over the weekend?
Oh, that is a slight exaggeration.
A slight exaggeration.
But we sat down and got the essential idea over one weekend, and we worked on. We were both in the. I was in the Army, and he was in the Navy. But it was a typology, and we just drew out of our experience.
What can you tell us about Ed?
Ed was the most interesting conversationalist I've ever met. He just sparkled with ideas, and no one with whom I would rather have a conversation. You'd suggest something, he'd suggest something else, you'd suggest something, and the ideas were just going back and forth. And he was a keen observer, and it was always interesting to walk around a city with him, because his eyes were just flashing around, and he was noticing things and remembering them and asking questions.
When I was a graduate student at Chicago, a boy came in who was writing a master's thesis on a town in northern Indiana, and he said, Ed, I can't find any reason for this town. There's no mountain, there's no valley, there's no river, there's no nothing. And I looked at the map, and sure enough, it's just a featureless plain. Then suddenly the idea came to me that just every so often you needed a place for a farmer to come in and buy a soda or something like that. And that started me off on making frequency counts through the Middle West, and this was going to be my life work. Then I went back to Harvard, and I was mentioning this to everybody, and they said, you should see a man who is here. I finally went around to see him as he was packing up to leave, and this man turned out to be August Lesch. I described my idea to him, and a strange light came in his eyes. That's the only way I can describe it. And he wrote down a piece of paper, you should see Walter Christaller, the Zentralen Orte in Süddeutschland. Well, I had run into the classic thing of a German scholar having thought of it before I did. But I did translate his stuff. I couldn't get any help from anybody in translating. The German department of Chicago was no use. But I could translate it because I knew what he was going to say. I always said since that time, it's easier to get an original idea in English than to translate it secondhand from German.
Well, where do you think we've looked back? Where are we headed? What are the current trends that you see?
They're frightening. I do find
the constricting world rather frightening. I suspect we have 20, 25 years in which time to come into some sort of ecological balance with the environment, and if not, the possibilities are not attractive. At the extreme, if you want my most extreme position, I think that a good nuclear war that knocked out 90% of the species might lengthen the life of the species by several tens of thousands of years.
The frightening note on which to end.
And he asked me what had impressed me the most in my first weeks in America. And my answer was automatically the density of big cities between New York and Washington.
Yes.
I think that was the birth moment of
megawatt. And what about the word itself? Did that come?
The word itself, that was 1952. A luncheon at the Institute for Advanced Study, discussing my research with a group of my colleagues here, and we were joined by the then director of the Institute, the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who was another important influence on my life later on. And Oppenheimer, hearing what I was saying about my research in big cities, said, well, what you are talking about is megapolis. At that time, the physicists were beginning to talk about megatons, major explosions. And there was a classicist at the table, Harold Chernis, who immediately protested. Megapolis is not correct. It has to be megalopolis, because polis is feminine, and we have to be correct in Greek.
How would you compare the main problems of geography in 1982, and the possibilities for geography in 1982?
Well, I think there are a number of problems. One is that we tend to be concentrating very much on process, social, economic, and physical, and these have tended to disbalance our really proper concern with form, which I think is important. In some branches of the discipline, we seem to be concentrating on problems which are on too small scales of space and time. I think there's a very healthy move towards the investigation of sort of socio-political causation in geography. I think that's important. But I'm afraid that for some people, tending to change the object of geography, which is becoming for some people a sort of subjective vehicle for social change. And I've got some doubts about this. I'm also a bit worried about quantitative spatial studies, which I really think are pretty central and have always been central to new geography, because they seem to be concentrating so much on the analysis of phenomena which are of rather marginal geographical interest. I think geography is not concerned with the sort of spatial analysis of everything, but only within certain ranges of space and time. I think too little thought has been given to the whole question of the subject matter of geography. And I think also that there is a continued decline in the importance of the role of physical geography, and that is exercising. I think that it's partly due to technology breaking the man-land relationships, but I think it's also partly due to the fact that physical geographers are not consistently redefining their discipline. And also, I think the big problem for us is this whole problem of systems interfacing. How you interface the physical with the human systems, how you interface systems having to do with functional equilibrating with historical change. And I figure that these are going to be the big matters that people are going to have to face up to.
Now, could you, if you wish people to remember you for any one thing, what would you choose? One thing in geography.
Of my books?
Of your books, your many writings, yes.
I don't know. I think perhaps Ireland, because I think that what I did in that book gave, the first edition tried to give a picture of Ireland as it was, Ireland is a love of my life, one of them, and I still have had that, but I've had these other things as well, and I've had a very fortunate and rich life. But nobody must feel that they must remember me just out of courtesy or anything like that. I really couldn't care less. So there we are.
Yes. But you are so wide-ranging. I mean,
yes.
Your past, geography, 100 years of geography, for
yes.
instance. How do you rank that?
Well, somebody has to do it first, I think. And it wasn't right the first, but somebody has to do it, and then others can do better. I'd rather they did better than just said it was inferior. Let them try, and I'm always hoping that other people will enjoy sort of playing in the team as much as I have done. That's
Yes.
what I've really enjoyed. I've more sympathy with the people who are playing out on the field than with the fat old gentleman in the grandstand who was saying how it ought to be done.